Hollywood didn't try to break Marlon Brando with shouting or fists. Tried something far more effective. Silence. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp on a gray morning in 1950. Inside a paneled office on the Paramount lot. The walls were lined with framed posters of smiling stars. Men who knew how to behave, women who knew how to listen. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and furniture polish. Power lived in that room, old and unquestioned, and it had rules. Brando arrived at 8:58. No untold. No studio handler. No green. Just a man in a wrinkled jacket, hair refusing to cooperate, eyes alert but unreadable. He sat down without being invited, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. The studio executives noticed immediately. They always did. This wasn't how meetings worked. Actors were supposed to hover, grateful, attentive. They were supposed to perform eagerness before the performance. Brando didn't. He sat like he already belonged there, like the room needed to justify itself to him. The head of production, a heavy-set man with a practiced smile, cleared his throat. "Mr. Brando," he said, drawing out the name as if testing its weight. "We've had concerns." Brando nodded once. Not submissive, not defiant, just acknowledging the sound of words. "You're difficult," the executive continued. "You question directors. You refuse publicity appearances. You don't play the game." Brando looked at the framed posters. Stars frozen in perpetual obedience. "I play the work," he said quietly. "Not the game." A pause. Not the good kind. Hollywood men knew how to punish pauses. They let them stretch until you filled them with apologies. Brando didn't. Another executive leaned forward. "You're talented," he said, the words sounding almost resentful. "But talent isn't enough. We need reliability. Cooperation." Brando smiled then, just slightly. "You want compliance." The room stiffened. That wasn't the script. The head of production exhaled slowly. "We want professionalism." Brando's eyes finally met his. "Then you should stop confusing it with obedience." The meeting should have ended there. In another era with another actor it would have. But Brando was new. Dangerous in a way they didn't yet understand. He wasn't asking for permission. He was establishing terms. The studio tried something else. They slid a contract across the desk. Thick, heavy, clauses stacked like walls. Morality clauses. Behavior clauses. Clauses that allowed the studio to suspend, replace, ruin. "Standard," the executive said. "Sign and we move forward." Brando flipped through it slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't perform outrage. He read every line like a man reading a diagnosis. Then he stopped. "This," he said, tapping the page, "says you can shut me down if I bring disrepute to the studio." "Yes," the executive said. "That's standard. Define disrepute." The executive smiled. "You know, embarrassment, non-cooperation." "Speaking my mind?" Brando asked. "If necessary." Brando closed the contract. "I won't sign that." The silence returned thicker now. "You won't work in this town," someone said. Not a threat. A statement of fact delivered calmly, like a weather report. Brando leaned back. "Then this town will have to explain why." They thought he was bluffing. They always did. Hollywood's power didn't come from shouting matches. Came from consensus. From quiet phone calls. From doors that stopped opening. From invitations that never arrived. From roles that went to safer men. After that meeting, the machine began to move. Scripts stopped coming. Casting directors stopped returning calls. Studio gossip labeled Brando unstable, ungrateful, a problem. The word traveled faster than truth ever did. He was advised, kindly, firmly, to apologize, to issue a statement, to smooth things over. Brando declined. He took odd jobs, theater work, anything that let him stay close to the craft without kneeling to the system. He studied people, listened, watched how men lied with confidence and called it authority. Hollywood waited him out. They expected him to bend. What they didn't understand was that Brando had already decided something in that first meeting. If this was the price of success, he'd rather pay in struggle than in silence. Then came the part they didn't see coming. A role landed on his lap, not because of studio approval, but because a director saw something dangerous in him. Something alive. Something that couldn't be taught. When Brando stepped onto that set, he didn't behave like a star. He behaved like a threat. He didn't hit his marks like a puppet. He inhabited them. He didn't recite lines. He breathed them. Other actors adjusted themselves unconsciously around him, like planets pulled by unexpected gravity. The camera loved him, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that audiences did too. They saw something raw. Masculinity without polish. Vulnerability without apology. Anger that wasn't theatrical but lived in. Suddenly, the man Hollywood tried to erase was unavoidable. Executives pretended it was their idea. They sent new contracts. Softer ones. Invitations to lunches that hadn't existed months earlier. The same men who warned he'd never work again now praised his intensity. His method. Brando read the contracts. He signed some. Rewrote others. Walked away when the terms smelled the same as before. He didn't forgive the machine. He learned how to navigate it without letting it own him. On sets, he challenged directors, not to dominate them but to make the work honest. When a scene felt false, he said so. When a line rang hollow, he refused it. He wasn't cruel. He was precise. And that frightened people who relied on authority instead of truth. There were consequences. He was labeled volatile again. Difficult again. But this time the audience was on his side. The box office backed him up. The industry could grumble, but it couldn't deny results. Power shifted quietly. The studios began adjusting to him. Not the other way around. Actors noticed. Younger performers watched Brando refuse to smile on cue. Refused to sell a version of himself that didn't exist. They saw a man survive defiance. Thrive in it. It planted a dangerous idea. That the system wasn't invincible. Behind closed doors, executives complained that he was setting a bad example. They were right. Brando never framed himself as a rebel. He didn't give speeches about freedom or art. He simply acted as if his dignity was non-negotiable. And in Hollywood, that was revolutionary. Years later, someone asked him about that first meeting. About the threats. The attempted blacklisting. About whether he'd been afraid. Brando shrugged. Of course I was, he said. But fear doesn't decide what's right. Hollywood didn't break him that morning. Taught him exactly what it was. And once you see the machine clearly, it loses some of its power. By the time the industry finally crowned him indispensable, Brando had already won. Not awards. Not money. Control. He chose his roles. He chose his silences. He chose when to walk away. The meeting that was meant to tame him became the moment he stopped asking permission. Hollywood tried to break Marlon Brando after one meeting. He let them try. And then he showed them what happens when an actor refuses to be owned. The industry never admitted it lost. Hollywood simply changed tactics. Instead of trying to crush Brando, it tried to absorb him. Invitations came wrapped in praise. Executives who once warned he was finished now spoke of him as essential, as if they'd always believed in him. Meetings were warmer, contracts looser. But the undertone remained the same. You belong to us now. Brando felt it immediately. Fame didn't soften the machine, it refined it. Where once it threatened openly, now it smiled. Where it once demanded obedience, now it offered indulgence. That Brando learned was the more dangerous phase. On set, directors approached him carefully, unsure whether they were collaborators or caretakers. Some resented him. Others feared him. A few understood him. Those were the ones Brando respected. He didn't undermine authority for sport. He challenged it when it lied. If a scene demanded honesty, he gave it, even if it made others uncomfortable. If a character was supposed to dominate but felt hollow, Brando exposed the hollowness. He refused to pretend strength where there was none. Studios complained he was unpredictable. Brando called it truth. Privately, executives met to discuss containment. How do you manage a man audiences trust more than institutions? How do you control someone who doesn't want your approval? You don't, they realized. You wait. You wait for arrogance. For scandal. For exhaustion. For self-destruction. Hollywood had broken men before. Better men. Smarter men. They assumed Brando would eventually do it for them. But Brando wasn't chasing immortality. He wasn't chasing love. He was chasing alignment between what he felt, what he did, and what he refused to tolerate. That made him harder to corner. When offered roles that required him to soften, to sanitize, to reassure audiences, he turned them down. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply said no. The word unsettled people. Hollywood preferred negotiation, leverage, manipulation. No ended conversations too cleanly. The press began circling. Articles praised his genius while questioning his stability. Profiles described his brilliance alongside warnings about his temperament. The implication was clear. Talent like this comes with a cost. Brando read none of it. He had learned early that listening to the industry talk about you was a form of slow poisoning. Instead, he watched how others reacted to his presence. How studio heads straightened when he entered a room. How writers rewrote scenes without being asked. How younger actors watched him closely, measuring what was possible. They didn't ask him for advice. They watched how he lived. Brando's real rebellion wasn't anger. It was refusal. Refusal to be predictable. Refusal to explain himself to people who weren't listening. Refusal to perform gratitude for systems designed to extract obedience. At parties, he stayed quiet, observed, let others fill the silence with self-importance. He learned who needed to be admired, who needed to dominate, who needed to be feared. And he learned something else. Hollywood only respected one thing more than money: leverage. So Brando built it carefully, film by film, performance by performance. Not through politicking but through inevitability. He made himself necessary. Studios didn't like him. They needed him. That distinction mattered. When he finally did accept roles under major banners, he negotiated from a position no actor of his generation had held before. Creative input, casting influence, script control. Conditions that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Executives signed because audiences demanded him, and because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Behind closed doors, they complained that Brando had changed the balance. That actors were getting ideas. That respect was being mistaken for entitlement. They were right again. What they didn't understand was that Brando wasn't trying to lead a movement. He wasn't interested in reforming Hollywood. He simply refused to surrender himself to it. That refusal echoed. Actors began asking harder questions. Directors began pushing back. Writers stopped apologizing for ambition. The machine didn't collapse, but it cracked. And cracks change everything. Years later, when younger performers spoke of artistic freedom, they rarely mentioned Brando directly. But they were living in the space he'd carved out. A space where saying no didn't automatically mean exile. Where power had to negotiate. Brando paid for it, of course. Isolation followed him. Misunderstanding. A reputation that never fully softened. He was never embraced the way safer legends were. He remained to the end. A problem Hollywood never solved. But he never asked to be solved. He asked to be left intact. In quieter moments, Brando reflected on that first meeting. The contract, the clauses, the certainty with which men had told him he would disappear. He didn't resent them. He understood them. They were defending a system built on control. What startled them wasn't his defiance. It was his endurance. Hollywood had expected submission or collapse. Instead, it got persistence. By the time history rewrote the narrative, by the time Brando was hailed as transformative, revolutionary, essential, the truth had already settled quietly. The industry hadn't shaped him. He had outlasted it. That first meeting was meant to be a warning. It became a lesson. Not just for Hollywood, but for anyone watching closely enough to learn it. Power depends on fear. Fear depends on belief. And belief dissolves the moment someone decides their dignity is worth more than access. Hollywood tried to break Marlon Brando after one meeting. It failed, not because he fought harder than they did, but because he refused to give them the one thing they needed most: ownership. And once that was gone, the machine could make noise, could threaten, could punish, but it could never truly control him. That was Brando's quiet victory. Not applause. Not approval. Not legacy. Freedom.